stranger in the storm. I peered through the lone sliver of kitchen window that wasn't covered by the storm shutters as flecks of rain pummeled the other side of the glass. You could always see the ocean through this window, between that first row of houses that lined the shore. On this afternoon, the water was angry, white caps rising and crashing into almost black water. Gray tendrils like those of some giant sea monster rose from the water, grasped the sky, and shook it with fury. Nancy's hand landed on my shoulder and startled me. She laughed, and the small symphony had its usual effect, calming my soul and bringing a smile to my lips. "I didn't mean to sneak up on you," Nancy said. "I was just watching the storm. It's getting bad out there." She moved beside me, put her head to the window pane, and squinted to look out at the darkening scene beyond. "Thank you for being here with me," she said, and nuzzled her shoulder into my arm, which I then wrapped around her. "Till death do us part, that was the vow," I said, as we stood there for a while longer, watching the outer bands of Hurricane Emily lash the neighborhood. This stilted house that stood a few hundred feet from the sea belonged to Nancy's mother, Jerry Lynn. Jerry Lynn had built the house 26 years earlier, with the life insurance money she had received following the sudden death of her husband, Harold. As newlyweds, Jerry Lynn and Harold had vowed to one day have a house by the ocean. Harold never got to realize that dream, but Jerry Lynn sprinkled Harold's ashes in with the concrete that anchored the pillars and in the mortar that lined the walls. Jerry Lynn thought it was a romantic gesture. Nancy, who was 8 at the time, thought it was weird and gross. And the contractors seemed to agree with Nancy. But they shrugged it off and began quietly referring to Jerry Lynn as Senora Loca. The nickname stuck, and Jerry Lynn gave the moniker to the small seaside restaurant she went on to open. Senora Loca became a favorite for locals and tourists alike for more than 20 years, until the cancer diagnosis forced her to close the doors and sell the business. Jerry Lynn put up one hell of a fight, but the disease ended up being like the slasher in an 80s horror film and just wouldn't stay dead. Senora Loca's declining health is what had brought Nancy and I to the coast, and what had kept us here, even after the mandatory evacuation orders ahead of the storm. Nancy had been bound and determined not to leave the hospital, but earlier in the day, we were ordered out. The rain and wind had already set in, and we decided to shelter in place at the house. "Category 4, huh?" Nancy said softly. "So they say." That guy from the Weather Channel showed up. I caught a few minutes of a segment in the waiting room earlier. "Oh, great. When he shows up, you know it's going to be a doozy." The lights in the kitchen began to flicker and went out a few seconds later. "Damn that Jim Cantori," Nancy said. "I think I remember how to crank up the generator," I said, walking toward the back door. The generator kept power to the water heater, the kitchen, main living room, and guest bathroom. Unfortunately, the HVAC unit didn't make the cut. We decided to keep cool by whirring up some frozen drinks, using some of Jerry Lynn's ample supply of vodka. "Well, at least there's enough booze to see us through a few weeks if it comes to that," I said. "But there's only enough orange juice for about 2 more pitchers." Nancy gave me her famous crooked smile. It usually meant good things were in store. She took a sip from her glass and joined me on the sofa. As soon as she sat down, someone began knocking at the door. "Who would be out in this?" I asked. "Probably first responders checking to see who hasn't evacuated." "Oh, great." The fuzz. An old man stood outside the door when I opened it. Wet, white hair was pasted to his head, and a soaking wet coat clung to his shoulders as the small, thin figure beneath the sodden fabric shivered in the wind. "I saw the porch light on," the man said. "The only light around at the moment." I glanced to my left and realized for the first time that the generator indeed also kept power to the porch light. but I was shocked that anyone would actually be able to see its glow given the current weather conditions. My car stalled out a few blocks away. I decided to try and walk back toward the highway and saw the porch light. The stranger continued. I stood silent for a moment, considering what this stranger had told me, looking for the lie. There was always a lie, at least in my experience. Nancy, always the kind-hearted optimist, gently pulled me away from the door and motioned for the man to come inside. "Come in out of the storm," she said. "Thank you. I really don't want to intrude," the stranger said. "My phone is dead too. I've been on it all day. May I charge it for a few minutes and then I'll get out of your hair?" "Plug it in the power strip over there," Nancy said, pointing to the surge protector beneath the TV. "I'll get some towels for you." Nancy disappeared into one of the dark back bedrooms of the house. The stranger plugged in his phone. It was one of those flip-open models that had been popular more than a decade earlier. "That's an antique you got there," I said, nodding at the phone, which began to glow blue as it absorbed the electrical current. "Yeah, suits my needs. I've reached the age where I don't like having to learn new things when I'm getting by just fine with the things I have." Nancy returned with several towels. "Here, dry off and let me take that coat to hang up in the laundry room. The generator doesn't power the dryer, but there's a drain in the floor to catch whatever drips off." The old man shed the sodden gray London fog jacket and wiped at his trousers and loafers with the towels. Nancy brought over a wooden chair from the kitchen and set it next to the stranger. "Here, have a seat," Nancy said. "A little water won't hurt this chair." The stranger lined the chair with one of the towels and sat down. He made one of those classic old man noises as he settled into the seat, a groan that may have been part agony and part relief. He ran a hand through his thinning white hair and then used another of the towels Nancy had given him to dry those damp strands. "Were you trying to get out of town when your car broke down?" I asked. "Looking for my wife," he said. "For your wife?" Nancy repeated. "Is she missing?" "Annette," he said, losing himself for a moment in a memory of the woman. "I've looked everywhere for her." "How long has she been missing?" I asked. "She disappeared just before the storm arrived," the man said. "She was worried about the bird feeders. I told her I'd make sure they were full as soon as the rain cleared, but she gets these things in her mind and has to do them. But then she gets confused." "Are the police looking for her?" Nancy inquired. "They say they are, but with this storm, who knows? She's wandered off before. I usually find her before they do. Her mind, you know. Some days she's here. Other days she's somewhere else." The wind picked up outside. Drops of rain sounded like a prizefighter's punches as they hit the house. Offering to help the man search in these conditions could get us killed. I looked over at Nancy. Her eyes said she knew what I was thinking. She nodded. "Tell us more about Annette." The old man began to tell us about his wife, how they met, the years they had spent together, where their children ended up. His face grew brighter with each memory he shared. Hours passed. At the moment I realized the wind was no longer howling beyond the walls. The old man's slip-screen phone began to ring in the corner of the room. He jumped from his chair, which sent a then almost dry towel falling to the ground, and rushed over to take the call. "Oh, that's great. That's just great," he said. "Thank you. Yes, I'll be over soon." He flipped the phone shut, unplugged it from the wall, and placed the cord in the pocket of his now wrinkled trousers. "She's home," he said with a warm smile. "That is great," I said. Before anything else could be said, he was walking out the front door with his gray coat beneath his arm. "Thank you for your kindness, but I have to hurry now." The door closed behind him. "What about his car?" Nancy said. I nodded and jogged over to the door. I don't see him. He can't have gotten far, Nancy said, coming over to the door. We stepped out into the damp evening air and took in the scope of the damage around us. The house to the left of us had collapsed. The roof had been torn from the house to the right. All around the perimeter of Jerry Lynn's little patch of land, debris was scattered. Yet her lawn and her home seemed unscathed. Wow, Nancy said. How? I asked. We walked and gasped each time we turned a corner. The storm had devastated much of the seaside neighborhood. The 3 narrow streets that surrounded Jerry Lynn's bungalow were, for the most part, underwater or under varying layers of sand and debris. There was no sign of a stalled car that we could see. A few vehicles were parked under homes and in driveways, many damaged by falling limbs and covered with palm fronds. One had a shattered windshield. He just disappeared, I said. There's no way, Nancy replied. We made our way down Jerry Lynn's street, knocking on doors and calling out for anyone who may be hurt. We discovered a few others in the neighborhood had chosen to weather the storm as well, and thankfully hadn't been injured. Their homes were another story. No one else had seen the old man or knew of an old woman in the area. When a pair of sheriff's deputies came patrolling a short time later, they said they hadn't received any reports of a missing woman after we told them about the old man and his story. Reminds me of the Wilsons, though, the older deputy remarked. What do you mean? I asked. The lawman took a deep breath as he summoned the memory of the case. Last time we had a Cat 4 blow through, I guess it was 19 years ago now, Gray Wilson called in that his wife had wandered away again. She was a frequent flyer, was a sweet old lady, but she really needed to be in a place with constant care. We promised him we'd search, but we needed him to stay put because things were getting bad. Old Gray, though, he couldn't bear the thought of Annette out there in that storm, confused and afraid. Did he go out driving to look for her? Nancy asked. Yep. Did his car stall out? I asked. Over near King's Highway, the deputy said. Not that far from here, actually. We found his car a few hours after the storm. No sign of Gray, though. What about Annette? We found her body the next day, poor thing. But Gray, he just seemed to vanish. There have been stories, though, over the years. Seems like every time there's a hurricane nearby, the younger deputy added. Someone sees an old man, drenched to the bone in a gray coat, the older deputy continued. If you believe that sort of thing, they say seeing old Gray is a good omen, that you'll find shelter and peace during the storm. Nancy and I both stood there, staring at the deputy, speechless. The senior deputy smiled at Nancy. Did Jerry Lynn's house hold up okay? Not a shingle or a nail out of place. Old Harold's ashes in the mortar held firm again, huh? The deputy said with a small laugh. Either that or old Gray Wilson did his trick again,
Stranger in the Storm,
the younger deputy
written
added.
and performed by Daljit Kalsi Jr., featuring original music and sound design by Neil Lee Griffin. Stranger in the Storm is a modern interpretation of the Gray Man legend. If you're not familiar with the Gray Man, he's a specter that often appears before a hurricane hits the South Carolina coast, and anyone who sees him finds safe harbor during the storm.